Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be going over game numero 4 for the 2013 World Chess Championship between Anand, the reigning champion, and Magnus Carlsen, the highest rated chess player in the world. In this particular game, game number 4, Anand's going to be playing the white pieces. Magnus Carlsen is going to be defending with the black pieces. And up until this point, if you've been keeping up with the series, we are tied at 3 draws to 3 draws. Each game has gotten a little bit more exciting. The first 2 were probably some of the most boring games I've ever seen. Only lasted 16 and 20 something moves respectively. The last game was actually pretty exciting, although it didn't end up going to a draw. This game is actually the longest game that we've had, so definitely get to actually see some chess going on. So we'll go ahead and get into it. Anand starts with pawn e4, and then after e5 we get into the Rai Lopez, which is one of the more common openings after this pawn here to e4. A lot of different ways that Magnus Carlsen can respond. Decides to go for the Berlin defense, something that Garry Kasparov used to play quite a bit. Obviously Magnus Carlsen and Garry Kasparov have trained a lot together. Once Garry Kasparov actually, hung it up and kind of retired, he actually took Magnus Carlsen under his wing and trained him up a bit. My guess is that at some point in that training, the Berlin defense came up because, again, Kasparov used it kind of at the high stage. So Magnus Carlsen, like he has been the entire tournament, was playing extremely quickly at the beginning of the game. His opening book, where a lot of the moves are memorized, didn't have to think about too much at all. So went into the Berlin defense. After Castle decides to go ahead and take this pawn here on e4. Anand doesn't even try to right away combat this and plays this pawn to d4. Magnus Carlsen decides not to go ahead and try to hold on to it. It can be very dangerous and cumbersome to try to hold on to this pawn advantage. So he decides to just come back here to knight to d6. And then after the bishop takes and we have the exchange, then as you can see, both sides are now equal in material. So this knight's going to come back here to f5. Again, not really any great square to take this. And white decided to go ahead and exchange here. The queens come off the board, so black cannot castle on either side of the board, although depending on how familiar you are with chess, usually that's not the worst thing ever if your opponent's queen is off the board. If your opponent's queen is on the board, that's usually when you really care more about at least castling on one side of the board. But your king can usually stay pretty safe even in the center of the board if your opponent's queen is off the board. Now you still have to, watch out for a few things here and there, but as you approach the end game, you actually want your king more involved into the game, more in the center of the board, so he can actually be a powerful piece in your attack. And so this is definitely not a bad place for this king to be right now. So we now see Anand play a pawn here to h1, and then we see the bishop come to d7, and then the rook's going to swing over here to d1, kind of pin down this bishop here, and then bishop here to e7. And this is definitely a defense that I don't see very often, even studying a lot of famous events. This formation right here is not seen very often, but my guess is Magnus Carlsen is pretty comfortable with this and has studied this position before. So from here we see knight to c3 again, getting the rest of the pieces developed in the game for Anand, and then we see the king coming over here to c8. This does somewhat cramp the position for Magnus Carlsen. It's going to be a little bit harder for this rook here on a8 to get involved into the action. Could have tried something, bringing it over to e8 if he wanted to. Definitely wants to make sure that his bishop's not pinned so he can move this, but this again does cramp him a little bit. Now we see the bishop come here to g5. Definitely want to, finish up with the development right here. And then we just see the pawn to h6, and then both sides decide to go ahead and trade off their bishop here on e7. So going into the middle and end game, we see kind of a 2-knight versus a bishop and a knight from black. Now we see the rook come over here to d2. Again, d2, d3 both fine. Definitely want to go ahead, and there's one open file, and that's the d file. You always want your rooks on an open file, so that's exactly what Anand's going for. He's going to try to double up his rooks right here and really hone down on controlling this d file, where knowing that if he looks at his opponent, this a8 rook right here, he can't get involved into the action. It's going to be a few moves, and again, it's going to be, one too little just to bring his rook over here to d8 right now. So that's kind of the plan of attack right now. Pawn now comes to c5, wants to get some sort of opening over here so that black can start to maneuver some of his pieces. And then we see the rook swing over to d1, kind of as we talked about, and then the bishop comes to e6, recognizing that okay, there's too many attackers on the bishop, so he wants to make sure and gets out of the way, and kind of brings it to this nice central square right now. Now the knight's going to come back here to e1, and this is where I think a lot of the wheels fell off for Anand. This was, in my opinion, everyone kind of has their opinion. This was the worst move in the match for me. If you kind of look at it, Anand actually has a pretty nice setup right here. Both sides are even in material, but if you look at it, black has doubled pawns here on the c file. White controls the center of the board. He does have the e pawn right here. Black doesn't have his e or d pawn. White has both of his rooks dominating this d file. We have the king right here on c8 that's not doing anything, but it's also cramping the style of the rook on a8. So again, Anand, he can really start to put the pressure. Anytime you have a large lead like this, you can really start to play a move that will force your opponent to do something. So from here we could have seen knight here to e4, more of a centralizing piece, also attacking this pawn here on c5. This is definitely much more active. Instead, again, this knight's also protecting this pawn on e5, so when that moves away, it doesn't have that. So he instead decides to bring his knight down to e1, and then after the knight to g6, attacking this pawn here on e5, then the knight's going to swing over here to d3, which is now attacking this pawn on c5, but then all black has to do is play just pawn here to b6. And so if we kind of look at it, white has gone from a nice little active position, attacking this pawn, all of a sudden to bringing his knight to a worse square, because now this knight's blocking both of these rooks here on d1 and d2. They're definitely not as active as they used to be. And all this just to bring his knight over so he can attack it. And all Magnus Carlsen had to do was just play this pawn here to b6. So definitely one of the more questionable moves that I saw in the tournament so far, just because again, Anand just really had a huge lead in my opinion, and then just pretty much gave it away in just a couple moves. And after this, is White's move, and I kind of expected Anand to kind of regroup and kind of assess the situation and realize, okay, we have this pawn right here. It is being protected by this knight on c3, so you definitely want to keep this knight here on c3. You could play something like pawn to b3 to kind of protect it, so now you can play your knight somewhere else if you wanted to centralize it. Knight here to e4. You could always bring it to knight here to e2. Instead, White decides to go ahead and just bring his knight to e2, leaving that pawn hanging, and Magnus Carlsen just immediately just eats it up here on a2. So black goes up in material. Again, we've gone from Anand being up to just a few moves later. In my opinion, black is definitely up. Definitely up in material. And then as far as in the game itself, definitely wants to make sure that he gets this rook involved. Could play king here to b7, and then get this rook involved into the game. So a few questionable moves from Anand, but Anand now plays pawn to b3, trying to trap the bishop, and then this pawn here to c4, recognizing that this is kind of the only way to safely hold on to this bishop. And so now the knight takes, and the pawn's going to take. Can't take right now just because the pawn's going to push forward. Too much pressure. So instead decides to take that pawn. Now the bishop's going to come back, and now it's going to be able to come back safely after the knight comes here to c3. Then the bishop's going to swing back here to f5. So again, if we kind of look at it, if we assess the situation, black has 6 pawns to the 5 pawns from white's. White has 2 of his knights, so he would really like to keep things on one side of the board. Typically, as you go towards the end game, bishops do really well if there's 2 sides. So, in this case, there's this pawn chain over here and this pawn chain over here, because bishops can get to both sides of the board very quickly. But knights really prefer to stay on one side of the board because they can kind of hop around, and if they can just maintain one side of the board, they can just really dominate, where a bishop can't really dominate just one side of the board. So we'll continue. Pawn pushes forward to g4. Again, you don't really have to worry. We're getting towards middle endgame here. Don't have to worry too much about the air in front of your king, because you're actually going to want to get your king involved into the game. So this is just kind of pushing the bishop back. The bishop comes back here to c8. Again, no great squares for this bishop. Can't come here to d7 because the rooks. Can't come here to e6 because then this pawn here to f5 would win one of these pieces. So again, c8 does give Anand a little breathing room, because again it does block off this rook on a8, and it's not always about the pieces you have, but it's about the pieces you have in the fight, and this rook on a8 is not doing a whole heck of a lot of anything. So the knight's now going to come to d3. Again, back here on the first rank's not doing anything, so starting to get his pieces more involved into the game. We see pawn to h5, trying to kind of disrupt these light squares over here so that he can get his light square bishop involved into the game. And now we see pawn here to f5, again kind of forcing the knight to move. And now we see knight over here to b5, recognizing that, okay, this is really going to be where white can start to put a lot of pressure. He does have these rooks that he can double up on anything, so he can swing both of his rooks over here and put a lot of pressure on this pawn on c7. So that's kind of exactly what white's plan is just to have this knight here and then start to attack. And so now we see the pawn take and the pawn recapture, but this also does give black the opportunity to kind of control this long file right here on the h file. So you can at any time see this rook swoop down and start to attack white on the king side. And so right away we see the rook come over to h4, attacking this pawn right here, and then knight comes back here to f2. You always want to have your opponent having their pieces protect, and you never want them to attack. So this is exactly where Magnus Carlsen would like this knight. It's not very active, it's not in the center of the board, and all it's really doing is protecting this pawn here on g4. Now we see the knight come to c6, again attacking this pawn here on e6. And then this rook swings over here to c2. Again, it would be a mistake now to go ahead and take this pawn on e5, because just the rook can swing up here to c7. This would definitely be bad. So this kind of inadvertently protects this pawn here on e5. So now we see the pawn push forward to a5 again, just trying to get some breathing room over here. If the pawn's right here and there's a check, it could get pretty awkward, if the rook swings over here. So this is definitely going to be a nice little move to give black some space over here, and later on he may just want to push forward, and having your pawns further down the board is never a bad thing. So this rook's going to swing up to c4, put another additional defender on this pawn over here on g4. It can also now double up his rooks, and can now also get his knight involved into the game if he wants to. So now we see the pawn pushing forward to g6 again. Threatening all these light square pawns is a great way to get this light square bishop involved into the action. So now we see the rook swing over to c1, and then the bishop coming here to d7, and then pushing forward, and so we're just going to have an exchange of pawns right now. And the bishop comes back here to e8, and then knight here to e4. Definitely an interesting move, and a lot of the analysts actually looked at this and kind of applauded Anand for finding this move. As I look at it, I think it's very interesting. Obviously, this immediately allows black to go ahead and come in here to g4. And I think results-based, if you look at it and see Magnus Carlsen's moves, you see the king come up here to f2, and then the rook come to f4, and then the king come up here. And there's no real compensation, so the rook has to swing back here to f8. And then white can start to attack over here. Now black is up 2 pawns of material. White's going to be able to regain one of those. And so, again, this is a nice central square for white. But, if I kind of come back here and let's say we look at, this position right here after the knight comes to e4. If Magnus Carlsen takes, if the king comes now to f2 and Magnus Carlsen realizes that just swinging up here to f4 isn't going to be doing anything right away, and let's say he plays rook here to d8. It's not as forcing right away, but he still does have this active rook on g4, and then you could see, the king to e3, and then this rook swing down here to d5, attacking this knight here on b5. Both of his rooks are very active. In this particular case, black took that pawn, And this knight here on e4 doesn't look like the best move ever. Now, again, in the particular game, it actually ended up working extremely well for Anand. He did have a more active knight in the game, and Magnus Carlsen kind of retreated his rook back here to f8. So it ended up being good. I don't think it was as good as some people were saying it was. I just think Magnus Carlsen kind of took the position and kind of gave it back. So in the particular game, again, Magnus Carlsen checked, and then after the king moves, then the rook swings back here, and we still have this rook over on a8 that's not doing anything at all. Now White's going to play a knight here to d4, again, kind of welcoming the fact that this pawn, or this knight can take here, and then the rook can swing up here, take that pawn, and then take back. And so that's exactly what we see. The rook's going to swing up here to c7, get one of those pawns back in material, and then after the king moves, then this knight's going to take right here. So in this particular case, White has a much more active position now. He does have material disadvantage, but his pieces are definitely in the center of the board, and Black's, while he's up, he's not really doing too much as far as being super active. So we kind of play it out, starting to get his pieces involved into the game, forcing this king around the board. And Anand's pretty much okay with just exchanging pieces off the board. Magnus Carlsen definitely fights for a long time to see if he can kind of grind down his opponent, which he does many times. Tries to find a small imperfection in the play from his opponent, and then he just strikes immediately. Unfortunately, didn't find that in this particular game. Although it does have a pawn advantage, sometimes that's just not enough. It usually ends in a draw if your opponent plays perfectly, which Anand actually defended extremely well in this position. So as we kind of come through, both sides just kind of maneuvering around, and then we see both of the minor pieces come off the board, and then it's kind of a, what's going to happen with these two pawns. Anand would really like to just go ahead and, exchange off these pawns and then just worry about this one side of the board. He was also really like to exchange one of these rooks off the board. So he decides to go and play this pawn to e7, again threatening, one more move to promote. So that's something Magnus Carlsen is going to have to look at the rest of the game. Plays this nice little move of, rook over here to g3, still threatening, his rook here, attacking this pawn here on e7. So this rook can't come over here to g8 and threaten, because now it can just take, and this pawn's still protected right here. So that's definitely, nice little move. Now the rook's going to swing over here to c3 again, and Anand doesn't mind just exchanging off. Magnus Carlsen doesn't want to do that right away, and so kind of moves around. Now we see this pawn start to push forward, still maintaining pressure on this e-file, because wants to make sure that there isn't something crazy that happens where White can actually get a queen out of this. So again, each of the players move quite a bit more. Nothing too crazy. This is all just kind of tactical in games that players go through in the double rook in game. And so as we kind of move through, eventually both sides decide, okay, we're going to go ahead and just start exchanging pieces. And so we see the pawn take, and then we see after this pawn take, as we come through, there's exchange right here. In this position, they actually decided to draw. Although Black is up material as far as one pawn, this is actually an in-game that's going to end in a draw or a stalemate, depending on how you look at it. So, definitely an exciting game. I think, my opinion, I'm going to go ahead and make it known that I think that Magnus Carlsen, after watching the first 4 games, will end up winning this tournament. I think he's starting to get into a rhythm. I think watching Anand play, even after just 4 games, he's starting to make a few mistakes. I don't know if he's tired or if he's not as prepared as Magnus Carlsen. But I think after, this is a very long tournament. So I think by the end of this, Magnus Carlsen, being such a young guy in really good fitness shape, I think he's just going to grind down his opponent. Eventually Anand will make some mistakes. Magnus Carlsen will capitalize, and we'll start to see some wins. I actually think that's why some of these games Magnus Carlsen's going down to the 64th move, not necessarily to win the game, but to kind of grind down his opponent, try to take some energy away from his opponent for later games down the road. So I'm definitely hopeful watching this game that we're going to see some fireworks later on. So hopefully you guys enjoyed Game 4. Again, we're tied up 4 draws to 4 draws, but looking forward to some exciting games in the future. Thanks for watching.